Good evening. Before you close your eyes tonight, come with me back through the centuries, over mountains and oceans, to the places where humankind first met the taste of wakefulness. There are landscapes in this world that hum quietly with alertness. High on the shoulders of Ethiopia, where the air is cool and the clouds drift like slow wool, small red berries once ripened on wild shrubs. Far across the seas, in the steaming basins of the Amazon, thick green leaves hid pale, bitter seeds that could stir the blood. Beneath the heavy canopy of West Africa, the kola nut grew, a small crimson almond that travelers carried to chew on long journeys. And in China's misted hills, glossy leaves unfurled beneath steady hands, their subtle fragrance promising a calm that was both soothing and sharp. Each of these plants, tea, coffee, cacao, and cola, emerged from different soils, shaped by different suns, yet they shared one mysterious gift. Hidden within them was a family of tiny, restless molecules, caffeine, theobromine, and their cousins. To the body, they whispered a simple lie, that sleep could wait. Long before chemistry had a name for them, people felt their power. In the highlands of Ethiopia, shepherds tended their flocks across a rugged landscape of stones and shrubs. One legend tells of Kaldi, a goatherd who noticed his animals leaping with sudden energy after nibbling bright red cherries. He tried them himself, felt a curious spark behind his eyes, and carried the fruit to a nearby monastery. The monks, wary but intrigued, boiled the beans to test their worth. The drink kept them awake through long hours of prayer. The story may not be entirely true, but it holds a truth of another kind, the way discovery often begins, by watching, wondering, and tasting. In the rainforests of the Americas, long before ships and maps divided the land, people found a tree whose pods concealed pale seeds wrapped in white pulp. They fermented, roasted, and ground them, making a dark, frothy liquid they called sokolaut. It was bitter, almost defiant, yet filled with strength. To the Maya and later the Aztecs, this was no simple drink. It was a sacred companion. Warriors drank it before battle, priests before ceremony, rulers during rites of power. In its foam lived the symbol of life's energy. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Africa, travelers resting beneath the shade of tall trees shared the kola nut. Its taste was sharp, its color the red of clay and sunset. Among Yoruba and other West African peoples, kola was a gift of friendship and trust, offered at weddings and peace talks, at births and farewells. It bound people together, each chew a shared heartbeat of endurance. And in East Asia, tea grew quietly into legend. The Chinese tell a gentle story. The sage Emperor Shen Nong, seated beneath a tree, boiled water to test its purity. A leaf drifted down into his cup. He drank and felt restored. Whether true or not, that story captures tea's essence, accidental grace. In the centuries that followed, tea would slip from medicine to ritual, from monasteries to palaces, until it shaped the rhythm of entire empires. All these moments, small, local, unconnected, were the first chapters in the story of caffeine. They began as whispers in the dark, leaves steeped for monks, berries chewed by herdsmen, beans ground for priests, nuts traded by travelers. None of them could have known what they were starting. The first encounters were intimate, personal. Imagine a man sitting by a small fire, stirring leaves into a bowl of hot water. The scent rises, faintly floral, faintly bitter. He drinks, expecting nothing, and suddenly the world sharpens. The stars seem brighter. The night grows lighter. He feels for the first time that dawn can wait. That was the quiet beginning of what would become a global habit. Every sip of caffeine is a borrowed hour. It doesn't give energy, it rearranges it. It postpones the body's surrender to rest. The heart beats a little faster. The mind hums a little louder. For early peoples, that small gift was sacred. Wakefulness meant vigilance during a hunt, concentration in prayer, or safety during the long dark. Staying awake could be survival. So caffeine became a bridge between need and devotion, between body and spirit. The monks of Yemen used it to pray longer. The shamans of the Americas drank it to speak to gods. The merchants of Africa carried it to stay awake through the desert. The scholars of China sipped it to write, reflect, and endure the night. And yet, behind every ritual was the same simple miracle, a plant teaching a person how to stay awake. It is humbling to think that the modern world, with its buzzing screens and sleepless cities, grew from those quiet moments. The first people to brew, chew, or roast had no idea they were inventing the chemical rhythm of civilization. They only knew that it felt good to keep the fire burning a little longer. The taste itself carried meaning. Tea was subtle, grassy, light, and alert calm. Coffee was smoky, earthy, alive, wakefulness with weight. Chocolate was smooth and warming, a slow joy. Cola was sharp and electric, the taste of energy itself. Each spoke a different dialect of the same language of focus. Across centuries, across continents, this shared discovery began to travel. A goatherd's curiosity in Ethiopia echoed in the careful rituals of Chinese scholars. The bubbling drink of the Maya found distant relatives in African ceremonies. And always at the heart of it, a molecule small enough to pass through the walls of the brain, yet powerful enough to redraw the map of human behavior. The earliest caffeine rituals were not global, they were local stories, told in smoke and song. But over time, they began to rhyme. Observation became experiment. Experiment became tradition. Tradition became trade. And trade, as it always does, would make everything bigger, more connected, more profitable, and more dangerous. Before that, though before the ships and plantations, there was only wonder. Wonder at how a leaf, a bean, or a nut could keep you company through the long dark hours. Wonder that such alertness could feel so peaceful. It is a curious balance, that first gift of caffeine. It wakes the mind but quiets the soul. It gives light but not frenzy. It invites thought without exhaustion. Even now, if you close your eyes and take a slow breath, you might feel the same hum that those first drinkers felt, the soft pulse of wakefulness traveling gently through your veins. This is where the story begins. Not with empire or money, but with curiosity and need, with hands that reached for something warm in the dark. From these hands, the world would learn to harvest time itself, one cup at a time. There are moments in human history when the ordinary becomes sacred, not because of a miracle, but because of repetition. A simple act, done often enough with enough meaning, turns into ritual. That is how caffeine began to take root, not just in plants, but in prayer, in trade, in ceremony, in the quiet pulse of daily life. Long before the modern world learned to call it chemistry, the world's first caffeine drinkers had already turned wakefulness into worship. In the monasteries of Yemen, under the pale lamps of oil and dawn, the Sufi mystics gathered. Their voices rose and fell in rhythm, chanting the divine names, breath by breath, through the long night. To sustain those hours, they brewed a dark, fragrant drink from roasted beans, the same red cherries that had once grown wild in Ethiopia's forests. The monks called it kawa, a word that once meant wine, but here it carried no intoxication, only clarity. They said it kept the soul awake, not just the eyes. And perhaps it did. The drink passed between hands, warm and earthy, and soon became woven into the fabric of Sufi devotion. In every order and lodge across Yemen, Mecca, and Cairo, coffee became the companion of prayer, a tool of spiritual endurance. The faithful believed that staying awake through the night, repeating the names of God, was an act of love. Coffee, then, was not indulgence, it was discipline, a gift for those who refused to sleep when the divine was near. Meanwhile, on the far side of the world, in the misted gardens of Tang Dynasty China, monks sat before small stone kettles. They watched the water reach its perfect shimmer before adding leaves plucked from their own monastery groves. The brew was pale green, delicate, and alive. They drank it in silence, their eyes calm and alert. To the Buddhists, tea was not merely a drink. It was part of meditation itself. The first sip was attention, the second was stillness, The third was understanding. In the dark halls of mountain temples, where the only sounds were wind and boiling water, tea helped bridge the body and the mind. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, tea had left the temple and entered courtly life. The scholar Lu Yu, known as the Sage of Tea, wrote the Classic of Tea, a book so simple, so elegant, that even centuries later it feels like a whisper from the past. He taught that tea was not only for monks or emperors, but for anyone who wished to find harmony in small things. He described how to choose the right water, the right fire, the right bowl, and through that ritual precision, tea became both art and order. 1,000 miles west, in the thick green of the tropical Americas, another ritual unfolded. The Maya and Aztec priests prepared their cacao not as sweet comfort, but as sacred medicine. The drink was thick, spiced, and bitter, a frothing darkness served in carved vessels. Its foam symbolized the breath of life, its taste, the strength of the gods. During ceremonies, warriors drank cacao before battle, priests before sacrifice, rulers before judgment. The gods, they believed, had given the cacao tree to humans as a link between earth and heaven. Its seeds were called food of the gods, a name that the scientific world would one day echo. When the plant was christened Theobroma cacao, even the act of preparation was ceremonial, roasting the beans, grinding them on stone slabs, mixing them with chili, corn, or honey, and pouring the liquid back and forth between bowls to raise its sacred foam. The air would have been heavy with scent, smoke, spice, and the slow hum of devotion. In these ancient worlds, caffeine was not consumed for work or productivity. It was taken for communion, for connection with something larger, unseen, eternal. And in West Africa, the kola nut continued its own journey. When two strangers met, they exchanged a nut, broke it, and shared its bitter heart. It was a bond, a spoken promise, a token of peace. He who brings kola brings life, went one proverb. To chew together was to trust each other. To offer kola was to acknowledge the other's worth. These rituals, tea in temples, coffee in monasteries, cacao in courts, and kola beneath the trees, each gave caffeine a moral weight. They transformed it from mere sustenance into a symbol. To drink was to participate in order, in meaning, in society itself. And yet, within that sacred stillness, something else began to stir. Where there is ritual, there is also repetition, and repetition invites trade. Pilgrims carried coffee from Yemen to Mecca, traders carried tea bricks across the Himalayas, and cacao beans passed from temple to marketplace. As the sacred became social, these brews began to travel farther than faith. But for a while longer, they still belonged to the spirit. Imagine it now, a Yemeni Sufi in the quiet blue before dawn, the steam of coffee curling around his prayer beads, a Chinese monk, pouring tea into a small bowl, its pale surface trembling with heat, an Aztec priest lifting a cup of chocolate toward the rising sun, a Yoruba elder offering cola to a guest beneath a mango tree. 4 people, 4 continents, 4 faiths, unaware of one another, yet connected by the same invisible thread of wakefulness. The chemistry they shared was the same molecule, but the meaning they gave it was infinitely human. Each sip was an act of awareness, a pause against sleep, a way of holding onto the moment before it slipped into darkness. In these sacred beginnings, caffeine became more than a stimulant. It became a metaphor for consciousness itself, the spark that refuses to fade. And perhaps that is why, even now, a warm drink feels like a small prayer. It steadies the hands, sharpens the thoughts, and creates a space between exhaustion and renewal. The cup becomes a quiet temple. The act of drinking, a ritual of attention. As centuries passed, these rituals would move beyond their places of birth. The monk's cup would become the merchant's trade. The sacred drink would become the social one. And what began in silence would soon echo through cities, ports, and palaces. But that transformation, the moment when the sacred met the worldly, was still to come. For now, picture the world before commerce, before the clang of ships and coins. a world where people still knelt before their cups, believing that to stay awake was to honor life itself. That is where caffeine first spoke to humanity, not in the noise of industry, but in the hush of devotion. The story of tea is, in many ways, the story of how something gentle and green came to rule the rhythm of an empire. It began in mountain monasteries, where leaves were picked by hand and steeped in silence. But over centuries, those same leaves would travel through palaces and tax ledgers, down rivers and canals, until they became both the flavor of daily life and the foundation of government revenue. Tea, more than any other drink, taught a civilization how to stay awake gracefully. By the early Tang dynasty in the 7th century, tea had moved beyond its purely medicinal roots. No longer just a tonic for monks, it had become a social ritual for poets, officials, and scholars. Across China, tea pavilions began to appear, quiet courtyards filled with bamboo, water, and the sound of porcelain cups meeting wooden tables. Drinking tea was an act of attention, a celebration of refinement. The scholar Lu Yu, who lived during the 8th century, gave this world its scripture, the classic of Tea Cha Jing. His book was small, precise, and poetic, a manual on how to boil water, how to roast leaves, how to choose the right bowl. But beneath those instructions lay a philosophy that the way one makes tea reflects the way one lives. Order, care, and balance were the essence of both. Lu Yu's writing transformed tea from habit into art. He described the ideal water, the proper temperature, the purity of tools. He believed the making of tea should mirror the cultivation of character, disciplined, mindful, and calm. As the centuries turned, tea's presence deepened in Chinese life. By the Song dynasty, around the 10th to 13th centuries, tea had become both ceremony and commerce. Powdered tea, whisked into a bright foam, was served in refined gatherings among scholars and bureaucrats. It was both a test of taste and a measure of intellect. The preparation itself became a kind of meditation, an ordered dance of whisk and bowl. But tea was also becoming something more practical. It entered the economy of empire. The state, ever observant, saw its potential. Tea could be taxed, traded, and controlled. It was portable, durable, and loved by nearly everyone, from peasants in the fields to poets in the capital. So, the government began to treat tea as a matter of administration. Along the great river valleys of Fujian, Jiangxi, and Yunnan, terraced gardens appeared. The pattern of cultivation was standardized, 1 bud and 2 leaves, picked by trained hands. Farmers learned how to pluck, dry, and store with precision. The empire issued rules on quality and measurement. Warehouses filled with pressed tea bricks, compact, transportable, easy to count and move. The Grand Canal, that ribbon of water connecting north and south, carried tea toward the capital. Barges loaded with tribute tea sailed steadily toward the imperial city, where it would be offered to the emperor and the court. In this way, tea became both symbol and system, a reflection of order. It tied distant provinces to the center, not only through loyalty, but through logistics. Roads were maintained to move tea. Taxes were paid in tea. Soldiers on the frontier drank tea. Monks, merchants, and mandarins all shared its warmth. The ritual of drinking it, carefully, attentively, was more than a comfort. It was a kind of discipline. The officials who prepared for the civil service examinations sipped tea through long nights of study. Their success depended on alertness, endurance, and moderation, the same virtues the tea itself seemed to teach. In the capital, tea houses began to bloom like a second kind of garden. They were not solemn temples, but places of community. Poets read verses aloud, musicians played, merchants exchanged news. In the rising steam of countless cups, ideas circulated, art, philosophy, gossip, even dissent. Still, tea remained a deeply moral substance in Chinese imagination. It was purity made liquid, clear, calm, honest. To serve tea to a guest was to show respect. To drink tea alone was to cultivate thought. In both cases, the act bound people to a shared ideal of civility. And beneath all of this flowed a quiet truth. Tea helped hold the empire together. Its cultivation required coordination. Its trade demanded infrastructure. And its taste encouraged mindfulness. It was a stimulant that didn't provoke chaos, but steadied the hand and focused the mind. In that balance, the Chinese found a mirror of the order they sought in society. There was even strategy in its simplicity. Compressed tea bricks became a form of currency on the frontier, traded for horses and salt along the tea, horse road that wound from Yunnan into Tibet. Tea was not only a pleasure, it was a weapon of soft power, a means of diplomacy and control. The state's involvement grew so deep that entire provinces were defined by their tea. Imperial edicts set quotas and taxes. Inspectors traveled to verify quality. Tribute lists recorded which regions produced the finest leaves. The emperor's table became an index of geography, a liquid map of the realm. Yet amid all the rules and regulations, the act of drinking tea remained intimate. The scholar still poured slowly. The hermit still watched the swirl of steam. In the villages, laborers still shared a pot after long days in the fields. Tea's universality, the way it could be both imperial tribute and peasant comfort, gave it a strange and lasting power. Even as it fueled the empire's economy, tea also nourished its imagination. Poets wrote of the first cup that moistens the lips, the second that breaks loneliness, the third that lifts the spirit. In paintings, scholars were often shown with a teapot beside them, a symbol of composure and contemplation. It's easy, now, to see only the romance, the porcelain cups, the gardens, the stillness. But tea's serenity was built on systems, terraces carved by hand, canals maintained by labor, bureaucrats counting bundles and ledgers filled with numbers. The beauty of the ritual was balanced by the machinery of control. This was caffeine's first empire, a civilization run, in part, on clarity. Every cup was both a pleasure and a policy. Every leaf, a note in the empire's great rhythm of wakefulness. And so, what began as a monk's meditation became an administrative instrument, a stimulant not only for the body, but for an entire state. Tea taught a civilization how to stay awake, not just through the night, but through history itself. If tea was the drink of harmony, then cacao was the drink of passion. Where tea whispered of stillness and control, cacao spoke of strength, ritual, and power. Its taste was not soothing, it was bold, bitter, alive. And from the jungles of Central America to the palaces of Spain, that bitterness would one day sweeten the world. But before sugar touched it, cacao was sacred. In the dense forests of Mesoamerica, long before Europeans set sail or maps gave names to continents, the Maya cultivated a tree they called cacao. Its pods were oval and ridged, their shells thick and leathery. Inside, beneath a layer of white pulp, were seeds, small, hard, and bitter. To the Maya, these seeds were not merely food, they were divine. They believed the gods had discovered cacao in a mountain of abundance and shared it with humankind as a bridge between worlds. The Maya roasted and ground the seeds into a paste, mixed it with water, corn, and spices, chili, honey, and vanilla, and poured it back and forth between vessels until the liquid frothed. The foam, they said, carried the spirit of life. The drink itself, called zocolal, was served at rituals of birth, marriage, and sacrifice. It was offered to gods and consumed by kings. In painted murals and carved vessels, cacao appeared again and again, held in sacred hands, rising in spirals of foam toward the sky. When the Aztecs inherited this world, they transformed cacao from divine offering to imperial tribute. Every conquered region of their vast empire owed the capital bags of cacao beans as payment. In the records of tribute, the Codex Mendoza, each town is drawn beside its quota, thousands of beans counted and delivered to Tenochtitlan. These were not coins minted in metal but seeds, smooth and fragrant, traded by weight and number. A single cacao bean could buy a tamale, 100 could buy a slave. The economy itself pulsed with caffeine and theobromine. In marketplaces, merchants carried small pouches of beans, counting them carefully like currency. And in royal courts, the Emperor Montezuma was said to drink cup after cup of the bitter froth, sometimes flavored with vanilla, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with blood. To outsiders, it might have seemed excessive. To the Aztecs, it was divine accounting. Cacao was energy made visible, the fuel of bodies, temples, and armies alike. Then, in the year 1519, ships appeared on the horizon. When Hernan Cortés and his men arrived at Veracruz, they were greeted not with gold, but with cups of cacao. The Spanish soldiers watched with unease as Aztec nobles lifted the dark liquid in ceremony. They saw its foam, its thick bitterness, and could not understand why anyone would drink it. But they noticed something else: the care with which it was prepared, the reverence it commanded, the wealth it represented. When the conquistadors conquered the Aztec capital, they found storerooms filled with cacao beans. To them, it was just another spoil of empire. But slowly, curiosity replaced disdain. They took the seeds home. And when the drink crossed the ocean, it began to change. In Europe, cacao met sugar. Sugar, the true alchemy of empire, transformed bitterness into delight. In the Spanish court, chocolate became a luxury, sweetened with cane sugar from the Caribbean and spiced with cinnamon and vanilla. The once sacred foam was tamed into elegance. The drink lost its blood and heat, its ritual and divinity, and became something polite, something served in porcelain cups beside gold spoons. Yet even in its new sweetness, the old power lingered. The cacao bean was still a symbol of vitality, still a stimulant of thought and passion. European physicians claimed it cured melancholy and strengthened the heart. Monks debated whether it broke the fast. Aristocrats drank it in salons and whispered philosophy over its warmth. But behind every delicate cup lay the machinery of conquest. The sugar that sweetened the chocolate came from plantations, worked by enslaved Africans in the Caribbean and Brazil. The cacao itself was harvested by indigenous labor, forced into systems of tribute that echoed the Aztec empire they had replaced. The bitterness had not vanished. It had simply moved from the tongue to the world. Chocolate, once a sacred offering, had become the first truly global stimulant, a blend of New World plants, Old World appetites, and human labor stretched between continents. Its journey tells us something fundamental about how the modern world was built. What began as a ritual of gratitude became a ritual of consumption. What was once holy became habitual. And yet, beneath the layers of sugar and ceremony, the essence remained, the spark of energy, the moment of wakefulness. The Maya and Aztec priests had used cacao to reach the divine. The Europeans used it to survive their afternoons. Both believed in its magic. If tea taught discipline, cacao taught desire. If tea built order, cacao revealed the cost of pleasure. The two together, the calm and the craving, would define the dual heartbeat of modernity. It's strange to think that the world's first global economy began not with gold or steel, but with flavor, with the hunger for sweetness, and the need to stay awake. Every cup of chocolate served in a Spanish palace carried within it the shadows of a forest in Guatemala, the sweat of a plantation in Hispaniola, and the echo of an ancient priest whispering over the foam. And yet, humanity drank deeply. Because the taste of energy, the illusion of borrowed life, was too intoxicating to resist. By the 17th century, chocolate had joined tea and coffee in shaping Europe's appetite for alertness. Together, they created a triangle of pleasure: the stimulant, the sweetener, and the system that bound them. Soon, this triangle would give birth to something entirely new: an age of coffeehouses and commerce, of sugar and slavery, of revolution and reform, all brewed together under the same rising steam. But before we reach that storm, the story of caffeine takes one more turn south, to the rocky highlands of Arabia, where a small red berry began its own pilgrimage toward destiny. There, in the quiet terraces of Yemen, monks and merchants alike discovered the drink that would keep the world awake. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where the air is thin and bright, and the earth smells of rain and clay, a legend was born. It tells of a goat herder named Kaldi, who one afternoon noticed his animals behaving strangely. The goats lipped and danced with a wild, rhythmic energy, their eyes bright, their hooves tapping against the stones. Curious, Kaldi followed their trail and found them nibbling on clusters of red cherries that glowed like embers beneath the leaves of a small, evergreen shrub. He tasted one, and the world shifted. His fatigue melted away, replaced by a clean, vivid alertness. The night no longer felt heavy, the shadows seemed thinner, the stars closer. It is, of course, a legend softened by centuries of retelling. But like many legends, it hides a truth. Somewhere in these same highlands, perhaps 1,000 years ago, people really did discover that the berries of the coffee plant could sharpen the mind and steady the body. They first chewed them raw, then crushed and mixed them with animal fat, forming small balls to eat on long journeys. It was both food and fuel. But the leap from raw fruit to roasted bean, the moment coffee became drink rather than fruit, would take place farther east, across the Red Sea, in the rocky hills of Yemen. There, sometime around the 15th century, the transformation began. Yemen was a crossroads of faith and trade, its ports humming with merchants bound for Mecca, Cairo, and Constantinople. In the quiet interiors of its Sufi monasteries, monks sought ways to stay awake through long nights of prayer and chanting. Someone, perhaps experimenting, roasted the beans until they turned dark and fragrant. Someone else ground them and boiled them with water. What emerged was a black, aromatic liquid, bitter, yes, but alive. They called it kawa, a word that originally meant wine. Yet unlike wine, this drink cleared the mind instead of clouding it. It was, in a sense, a sacred inversion, the wine of wakefulness. The Sufi orders embraced it. During their Dhikr rituals, hours of rhythmic chanting meant to remember God. Coffee became their companion. The brew sustained devotion, allowing the faithful to lose themselves in prayer without surrendering to sleep. They said the drink opened the heart, that it connected the earthly and the divine. Soon, word spread beyond the monasteries. Pilgrims visiting Mecca carried the drink home to Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul. Traders brought the roasted beans to ports along the Indian Ocean. Everywhere it traveled, coffee found its purpose to awaken not only bodies, but cities. By the early 16th century, coffee houses began to appear in Yemen's port of Mocha, whose name, centuries later, would still cling to our lights and desserts. These early coffee houses were small, dimly lit places where travelers gathered to exchange stories and songs. They were called Quaves Cani, houses of coffee, and they quickly became centers of conversation and community. From the start, coffee was social. Tea was often solitary, an inward ritual of stillness. But coffee, even in its earliest days, called people together. Its bitterness encouraged talk, its warmth invited debate. And because it kept sleep at bay, it lengthened both work and wonder. For merchants, coffee was practical. For mystics, it was spiritual. For rulers, it was both opportunity and threat. Some religious authorities denounced it, claiming it was intoxicating and sinful. Others defended it as the sober man's wine, a gift that allowed the devout to remain vigilant. The debates only fueled its fame, and as the drink spread, so did the culture around it. Coffee roasting became an art. The beans were sorted by color, their aroma judged with care. The sound of beans cracking over flame became the heartbeat of a new economy. Spices like cardamom and cloves were added for flavor. Each region developed its own style. Ethiopian brews dark and earthy, Yemeni ones fragrant and spiced. By the 1500s, caravans carried sacks of coffee across the deserts toward the great cities of Islam. In Cairo, scholars gathered in coffee houses to read poetry. In Mecca, pilgrims refreshed themselves between prayers. In Istanbul, the Ottoman capital, coffee became a phenomenon. But that is a story for the next part. Before we cross into that empire, let's linger a moment here, in Yemen, where coffee truly found its voice. Imagine the scene, Stone houses stacked on terraced hillsides, their windows glowing in the dark. Inside, a Sufi sheikh stirs a pot over the fire. The room smells of smoke and roasted beans. Outside, the wind from the Red Sea brushes the walls. The monks sit in a circle, cups in hand, their chants rising and falling with the rhythm of the heart. This was how caffeine became sacred, through repetition, through intention, through the merging of the physical and the spiritual. It's a quiet irony. What began as a way to stay awake became, for many, a way to transcend wakefulness altogether. Coffee wasn't only about energy, it was about awareness, about seeing more clearly. It made the night seem purposeful, even holy. But as always happens, devotion led to commerce. The farmers of Yemen learned to cultivate the coffee tree systematically. They built terraces on dry hillsides, irrigated them with precious mountain water, and guarded their seeds carefully. For a time, the Arabs maintained a monopoly on the plant. Coffee exported from the port of Mocha was prized across the known world. But the beans were roasted before shipping, ensuring no one else could plant them. Still, the world was restless, and curiosity once again would not sleep. Pilgrims, sailors, and smugglers began carrying live seeds out of Arabia. Within a century, coffee would take root in India, Java, and the Caribbean. But its heart, its origin story, the idea that a drink could bind prayer, trade, and time itself, remained in those Yemeni hills. Coffee was more than a stimulant, it was a revelation, a reminder that wakefulness, when guided by purpose, could become devotion, and when paired with desire, could reshape the world. From the goat herder's discovery to the monk's midnight cup, coffee's early life was a journey of awakening, the kind that begins quietly and never really ends. By the time coffee reached the Ottoman Empire, it was no longer the secret of monks or mystics. It was the drink of the people. And yet, it carried with it something of that old devotion, a quiet intensity that would change the way men thought, spoke, and gathered. In the 16th century, Istanbul was the center of the world. The city shimmered like a mosaic between continents, its domes and minarets rising above the Bosphorus. Ships from Africa, Arabia, and Asia crowded its harbors, their holds filled with spices, silk, and now, sacks of dark brown beans. The air itself must have smelled like the edge of a story, smoke, sea, and the faint bitterness of roasted coffee. It was here that the world's first great cafes were born. The earliest were humble. Two merchants from Aleppo opened one in 1555 in the Tatakal district near the Grand Bazaar. They called it a kava kani, a house of coffee. Inside, customers sat on low benches, sipping the thick, dark brew poured from copper pots called sev. The drink was bitter but enlivening, served in small cups without sugar. It was nothing like the sweet concoctions of Europe that would follow. It was pure and serious, like the city itself. Soon, coffeehouses multiplied. Istanbul filled with them, hundreds, then thousands, each one alive with conversation, music, and smoke. They were called the schools of the wise, for in them men discussed poetry, politics, and philosophy. Merchants debated the price of spices, scholars recited verses from Rumi, storytellers wove epics that stretched for hours. Chessboards clicked softly beneath the murmur of voices. For the first time, people of different ranks and trades could sit side by side, equal before the small porcelain cup. Coffeehouses became places where ideas circulated as freely as the drink itself. They were, in their way, democratic spaces, open, stimulating, unpredictable. This, naturally, made rulers uneasy. The Ottoman authorities, always wary of gatherings beyond their control, saw danger in the steam rising from these pots. In 1623, Sultan Murad, fearing sedition, banned coffee entirely. Spies patrolled the streets, sniffing for the telltale aroma. Offenders were punished harshly. But coffee, by then, had seeped too deep into the soul of the city. People brewed it in secret, hiding their cups behind closed shutters. Even soldiers and courtiers could not resist. Within a few years, the ban was lifted, and coffee returned with more power than before. The Ottoman coffee house became a cultural engine. Poets performed improvised verses to clapping crowds. Philosophers debated fate and reason. Musicians played the oud and knee, their melodies curling through the smoke. For a small price, one could buy a cup and entry into a world of thought, and talk that stretched long into the night. In this way, coffee changed time itself. It lengthened the day, brightened the night, and created a new rhythm of social life. The act of gathering to drink became a habit of thinking. Coffee was also a mirror of empire. In its preparation and serving, one could glimpse Ottoman grace, the brass trays polished to gold, the hand-painted cups, the slow pour that revealed patience and precision. It was performance and hospitality intertwined. And always there was conversation. The word conversation in Ottoman Turkish carried echoes of friendship and philosophy. It meant not just talk, but communion. The coffee house offered something beyond entertainment. It gave people a space to be awake together. But beneath the laughter and music, deeper currents flowed. In a society ruled by hierarchy and faith, the coffee house allowed dissent to whisper. Political rumors began in these rooms, speculation about wars, taxes, or the Sultan's health. Coffee houses were sometimes called penny universities, because for the cost of a single cup, one could learn everything that mattered. Women, too, found their place in the culture, though not always in the same rooms. In the harem and private homes, coffee became a symbol of refinement and sensuality. A well-prepared cup could signify intelligence and taste. Marriage negotiations even included the coffee test. A woman would serve her suitor a cup, and his reaction, his manners, his patience, was considered a reflection of his worth. Through ritual and gossip, love and rebellion, coffee bound the empire together in invisible threads. From Istanbul, its influence spread outward, to Damascus, Cairo, and Mecca, where pilgrims carried it home in small bags. The Ottoman merchants exported not just beans, but a way of living, the idea that time could be shared, that wakefulness could be social. When European travelers first visited these coffee houses, they were astonished. The Englishman George Sandys wrote in 1610 that Turks meet there to discourse and to drink a certain black liquor. To his eyes, it was strange, men drinking without drunkenness, their talk lively but controlled. He could not yet see that this simple scene, coffee and conversation, was reshaping how humans would gather for centuries to come. In time, European cities would imitate it. The coffee house would become a stage for commerce, science, and revolution. But here, in Ottoman Istanbul, it remained something older and purer, a refuge for the restless, a temple for the thoughtful. Imagine it now, the clink of cups, the hiss of boiling water, the murmur of voices rising beneath a ceiling painted with smoke. Outside, the call to prayer echoes through narrow streets. Inside, men lean forward over chessboards, their eyes gleaming in the candlelight. Somewhere, a storyteller pauses mid-sentence, sips, and smiles before continuing. It is not hard to see why coffee was once feared by kings and loved by thinkers. In every sip was freedom, the kind that opens the eyes and refuses to close them again. The Ottoman coffee house did not just serve a drink. It brewed modernity one conversation at a time. By the time the first European ships docked at the port of Mocha, coffee had already conquered the Islamic world. It was no longer just a ritual drink, it was a rhythm of life. From Cairo to Constantinople, the scent of roasted beans drifted through narrow streets, mixing with the smoke of lamps, and the hum of poetry. The port of Mocha, nestled along Yemen's Red Sea coast, became the pulse of that rhythm, the gateway through which the world would taste wakefulness. The merchants who ruled Mocha were careful men. They guarded their beans as if they were jewels. Only roasted or boiled coffee could leave their ports, never the live seed. In this way, the Arabs maintained a near monopoly on the trade. The beans were shipped by dhow across the Red Sea to Egypt, by camel through Mecca, and north to the great Ottoman markets. But Europe, ever hungry for novelty, began to notice. Venetian traders were among the first to encounter the strange, bitter drink. At first, they thought it another Eastern medicine, perhaps an aphrodisiac or tonic. Yet when they sipped it, something stirred, an alert calm, unlike the intoxication of wine. Venice, with its cosmopolitan heart and merchant soul, quickly fell under coffee's spell. By the early 1600s, coffee houses began to appear in Italy, England, and France. Their arrival was not smooth. The Catholic Church initially viewed coffee with suspicion, calling it the bitter invention of Satan. Priests warned that the drink came from Muslim lands and might corrupt Christian souls. The story goes that Pope Clement V, curious about this new beverage, decided to taste it before condemning it. After a single sip, he smiled and declared, "This Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it." With his blessing, Europe's love affair with coffee began. In London, the first coffee house opened around 1652, run by a Greek merchant named Pasqua Rosé. His small stall stood near Cornhill, serving the turkey drink to curious customers for a penny a cup. The taste was strong, strange, and bitter, but the effect was undeniable. Londoners, used to ale and wine, found in coffee a new kind of intoxication, one of thought, not stupor. Soon, the city was filled with coffee houses. By the 1680s, there were hundreds, each one a hive of conversation, trade, and gossip. The air buzzed with ideas. Poets, merchants, scholars, and sailors sat together beneath clouds of smoke, arguing about everything from science to scripture. They called them penny universities. For the price of a single coin, one could buy a cup of coffee and access to the most stimulating minds of the age. Notices were pinned to the walls, pamphlets exchanged, arguments carried through the night. The world, it seemed, was learning to think aloud. The contrast with the tavern was striking. In taverns, the mind dulled with drink. In coffee houses, it sharpened. The energy of caffeine fueled a new kind of public conversation, rational, secular, and restless. It was here that newspapers were born, that merchants formed trading companies, and that scientists debated their discoveries. The London Stock Exchange itself began in a coffee house called Jonathan's, where traders met daily to exchange information and promises. Lloyd's of London, the great insurance market, began in another, where shipowners discussed their voyages over steaming cups. Even Isaac Newton and Samuel Pepys were known to haunt these places, drawn by the chatter and the caffeine alike. In Paris, coffee arrived with elegance. The first café opened in 1672, serving the Ottoman ambassador's entourage. A few decades later, Café Procope became the gathering place of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot, the philosophers of the Enlightenment. There, beneath chandeliers and candlelight, the air was thick with debate. Coffee was the drink of reason, the stimulant of rebellion. Across Europe, kings and clerics watched uneasily as the same pattern emerged. The coffee house was not just a shop, it was a stage for free thought. Revolution, it seemed, had a flavor, and it was bitter, black, and served hot. But not all was fire and argument. There was beauty, too, in the ritual of it. In the clatter of porcelain cups, in the swirl of steam, in the quiet communion of strangers united by curiosity. Coffee became both symbol and solace, a drink that bridged classes, religions, and nations. For the first time, people could gather not to worship or to fight, but simply to talk. The coffeehouse gave birth to a new kind of society, one that believed conversation itself could be a form of progress. Meanwhile, behind this flowering of intellect and commerce, darker networks were forming. The beans that filled Europe's cups still came from Yemen, carried through Ottoman and Venetian hands. Their price was high, their supply limited. European empires, Dutch, French, English, wanted more than just a cup. They wanted control. The Dutch were the first to act. Around 1616, they smuggled live coffee plants from Mocha to their colonies in Java, breaking the Arab monopoly. In time, those plantations would feed Europe's growing addiction. The French followed, carrying seedlings to the Caribbean. The Portuguese would plant them in Brazil. But for now, in the late 17th century, coffee was still a miracle, new, exciting, and slightly forbidden. Imagine a cold London morning, the streets wet with fog, the lamps burning low. Inside a crowded room, men in cloaks lean over tables, cups trembling in their hands. Outside, the city hums with the first beats of modern life. Inside, beneath the steady warmth of coffee, the future is being brewed, one idea at a time. The world was learning to stay awake not for prayer or survival, but for thought. And in that wakefulness, it was learning how to change itself. Every empire has its flavor. For Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, that flavor was sweetness, the taste of sugar melting into tea, coffee, and chocolate. It seemed harmless enough, a small pleasure after long hours of labor. But behind that sweetness lay one of the darkest engines of the modern world. Sugar was not a spice, it was a system. And caffeine, those cups of energy and elegance, became its partner, its perfect accomplice. When Europeans first encountered sugar, it was a luxury, an exotic crystal reserved for nobles and kings. But as coffeehouses and chocolate salons spread through London, Paris, and Amsterdam, demand exploded. The bitter drinks of the East and the Americas needed sugar's gentle balance. People could not get enough. The empire's answer was simple: grow more, no matter the cost. So they turned to the tropics. Across the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Saint Domingue, Martinique, and deep into Brazil's green interior, new plantations rose like scars on the land. There, under the searing sun, enslaved Africans were forced to cultivate, cut, and crush the cane that would sweeten Europe's cups. The triangular trade was born. Ships sailed from Europe laden with guns, textiles, and trinkets. In West Africa, these were traded for human lives. The enslaved were packed into the dark holds of ships and carried across the Atlantic on voyages so cruel that many never arrived. Those who survived were sold to plantation owners, their bodies turned into tools of empire. In return, the ships carried sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cocoa back to Europe, the raw fuel of modern consumption. It was a perfect, monstrous loop. Every teaspoon of sugar stirred into a cup of tea or coffee linked three continents together in a chain of profit and pain. The European elite drank refinement. The enslaved supplied it. The warmth that comforted one world froze the humanity of another. On the plantations, work never stopped. Cane had to be cut quickly before it spoiled. Men and women worked 12, sometimes 16 hours a day. At night, the boiling houses glowed red, smoke rising like incense for a cruel god of commerce. Overseers with whips enforced discipline. Disease, exhaustion, and despair claimed countless lives. Sugar made men rich, very rich. It built mansions in London, financed ships in Amsterdam, and paid for wars and universities. The wealth that flowed from the Caribbean and Brazil remade the world's economy. By the 18th century, sugar accounted for 1/5 of all European imports. And because sugar demanded caffeine, the two became inseparable. Coffee without sugar was too bitter for most Europeans. Chocolate without sugar was too harsh. Tea without sugar was too plain. And so, in every cup, every taste of pleasure, the hidden labor of millions dissolved unseen. There was another irony. The Enlightenment, the very age of reason, liberty, and human rights, was fueled by caffeine and sugar. Philosophers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau gathered in Parisian cafes, debating freedom while drinking sweetened coffee poured from silver pots. The British Parliament passed laws over breakfast tea, its members spooning sugar produced by enslaved hands. In that contradiction lay the foundation of modern hypocrisy, a civilization that praised liberty while living off bondage. But even in darkness, resistance stirred. In the night fields of Jamaica and Saint Domingue, enslaved people whispered songs of home. They sabotaged mills, slowed harvests, escaped into the forest to form maroon communities, hidden villages of freedom. Stories spread of rebellion, of vengeance, of a reckoning that would one day come. The plantation masters feared it. The merchants ignored it. But history, like a boiling pot, could not stay still forever. And yet, for the moment, sugar ruled. It sweetened not only cups but consciences. Europeans told themselves it was natural, that Africans were destined for labor. That profit was proof of divine favor. They built grand systems of justification, racial theories, economic treatises, theologies of dominance. All of it designed to make exploitation taste civilized. And through it all, the people of Europe kept drinking. Morning tea, midday coffee, evening chocolate. A rhythm of pleasure that hid its own heartbeat of pain. It's easy to imagine one of those coffee houses in London or Paris, the chatter bright, the cups gleaming, while across the ocean, in the dark belly of the Caribbean, men and women stood knee deep in cane, cutting for their masters. The same sun that ripened the sugar burned their backs raw. Even today, the ghost of that sweetness lingers. Every dessert, every cup, carries an invisible history. Sugar taught humanity a dangerous lesson, that pleasure can be bought with suffering, and that the cost of comfort is easy to forget when it tastes so good. But the enslaved did not forget. In their songs and revolts, they began to turn the bitterness back on those who drank it. Soon, from the fires of Saint-Domingue, a rebellion would rise that would shake the world. The Haitian Revolution, the moment when the slaves of sugar and coffee seized their freedom and forced the empires to taste their own bitterness. For now, though Europe remained intoxicated by its sweetness, unaware that the plantations that fed its appetite were already sowing the seeds of their own destruction. The age of sugar and slavery was both triumphant and tragic, the dawn of globalization and the shadow of its sin. The world had learned to stay awake. But what it saw when it opened its eyes was not peace, but chains. By the late 18th century, the Caribbean was the beating heart of European wealth and its deepest wound. The fields of sugar and coffee stretched endlessly across the islands, shimmering beneath the sun like oceans of green. But beneath that beauty lay the sound of chains. The world's new craving for sweetness and energy had created the most brutal economy ever imagined. And yet, within that darkness, something began to stir. The enslaved had been watching, listening. They had heard the masters talk about liberty and reason. They had seen the words of revolution arrive from across the Atlantic, liberté, égalité, fraternité. The slogans of the French Enlightenment, meant for citizens of Paris, found strange new meaning in the mouths of the enslaved men and women of Saint-Domingue. The island was France's richest colony, the jewel of the Caribbean. Its plantations produced nearly half of the world's sugar and much of its coffee. The soil was fertile, the profits unimaginable. But so was the cruelty. 500,000 enslaved Africans labored there under constant punishment. Life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. The planters lived in luxury on the backs of the dying. They drank coffee in silver cups, while the people who grew it worked to exhaustion in the fields. And then, one August night in 1791, the island caught fire. It began with a secret ceremony in the northern mountains, a gathering of enslaved people led by a Vodou priest named Bookman. They met beneath the trees, offered a sacrifice, and swore an oath. They would fight until every chain was broken. Lightning split the sky, and in that flash, the world changed. Within days, plantations burned from coast to coast. The enslaved rose by the thousands, armed with machetes, torches, and courage. Their revolt spread faster than any army. The planters fled or were killed. The colonial government collapsed. What began as rebellion became revolution. Among the leaders who emerged was a man named Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, brilliant, disciplined, and unyielding. He had learned to read, to think, to command. Toussaint believed in the promise of the Enlightenment, that liberty was not a gift, but a right. He forged alliances, negotiated with the French, and built an army that stunned Europe's powers. Under his leadership, the revolutionaries turned the plantations of sugar and coffee into battlegrounds for freedom. The fields that once fueled Europe's pleasure now fed its nightmares. The war raged for more than a decade. France, Spain, and Britain each sent armies to crush the uprising, but none succeeded. The Haitians, fighting for their very existence, refused to yield. In 1804, after years of fire and blood, they declared independence. Saint-Domingue became Haiti, the world's first black republic and the first nation born from a successful slave revolt. It was a miracle and a warning. Across Europe, the wealthy trembled. Their fortunes depended on sugar, coffee, and slavery. Haiti's victory threatened not only their profits, but the very idea of racial and imperial order. They tried to erase it. Maps labeled the island cursed. Ships refused to trade. But the idea of freedom, once kindled, could not be extinguished. The Haitian Revolution changed more than one island. It changed the world. It forced Europe to confront the contradiction between its ideals and its actions. It made clear that the same caffeine, fueled enlightenment that birthed democracy, had also built the slave plantation. And it changed the global economy of coffee itself. The destruction of Saint-Domingue's plantations crippled the world's supply. French merchants turned to other colonies, Martinique, Réunion, and eventually to the vast lands of South America. The coffee plant, restless as ever, migrated again. Brazil would soon rise to replace Haiti as the new empire of the bean. But the pattern remained. Wherever coffee took root, so too did inequality. In Central America, European settlers and local elites carved out estates, forcing indigenous and Afro-descendant workers into endless labor. The tools of oppression changed, but the rhythm did not. Coffee was profit, and profit demanded control. In the same years that Haiti fought for freedom, revolutions swept through Europe and the Americas. France overthrew its monarchy, America celebrated independence, Latin nations began to rise. Everywhere, people spoke of liberty and progress, but behind their slogans, the plantations still burned, the fields still whispered. Even within Haiti itself, the dream of equality faced its own shadows. The new republic was punished by the world that feared it. France demanded reparations for its lost property, including the freed slaves themselves. Haiti paid that debt for more than a century, draining its wealth back to the very empire it had defeated. The revolution had succeeded in breaking chains, but not in breaking the world's hunger for power. Still, something irreversible had happened. The age of innocence was over. No one could drink their coffee without, somewhere in their conscience, tasting the bitterness of its origin. The legacy of those fires, the rebellion of the enslaved, lingered in every cup poured afterward. The modern world had been baptized not only in caffeine, but in blood. And yet, out of that blood came something enduring, the idea that even the lowest, most forgotten people could rise and remake the world. Every revolution begins with wakefulness, with a refusal to sleep through injustice. Caffeine, in its strange, symbolic way, became both the drink of oppression and the drink of freedom. It kept tyrants working late into the night, but it also kept rebels awake long enough to win. When the smoke cleared, the plantations of the Caribbean lay in ruins, but coffee itself was alive, migrating once again, this time east and south, to the vast plantations of Java, Ceylon, and Brazil. The age of empire was not over. It was merely changing shape. In the next chapter of its journey, coffee would leave behind the islands of revolt and take root in the global soil of industry and expansion, where kings and corporations would cultivate it not for ritual, nor for freedom, but for empire. The story of Haiti was the first great awakening of the modern world, an awakening that came not from the gentle sip of caffeine, but from the roar of people who refused to stay asleep any longer. When the world's first coffee trees were planted outside Arabia, no one could have guessed they were planting the roots of empire. A single seed, smuggled from the guarded hills of Yemen, would grow into a vast colonial system, one that reshaped continents, built fortunes, and tied human lives to the restless rhythm of global trade. The story begins with a theft. For centuries, the Arabs had kept tight control over coffee cultivation. Yemen's port of Mocha was the only legal exporter, and every bean was boiled or roasted before it left, ensuring no one could plant it elsewhere. But curiosity, as always, found a way. In 1616, Dutch traders managed to obtain a few live coffee plants, some say through bribery, others through quiet theft, and carried them back to the botanical gardens of Amsterdam. The seeds thrived. The Dutch, who already commanded the spice trade through their powerful East India Company, saw the potential immediately. If they could grow coffee themselves, they could break the Arab monopoly and dominate a new market. So they turned to their colonial jewel, Java, the lush volcanic island in what is now Indonesia. There, on terraced slopes beneath the humid monsoon sky, the first coffee plantations outside Arabia took root. The Dutch forced local farmers to grow it under a system they called cultuurstelsel, the culture system. It sounded civilized, but it was anything but. Villages were required to set aside part of their land and labor to grow cash crops, coffee, sugar, indigo, for the company's profit. The farmers had no choice. The Dutch took the harvests, fixed the prices, and shipped the beans back to Europe. Those who refused faced punishment, famine, or ruin. Java's hills turned green with profit, but the people grew poorer with every crop. By the early 18th century, Dutch Java coffee had conquered Europe. In the markets of Amsterdam and London, Java became synonymous with the drink itself. Coffee houses served it to merchants who never thought of the hands that picked it. To them, it was simply the taste of progress. But the plant was restless. It wanted to spread. In 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam gifted a young coffee plant to King Louis Sive of France. It was placed in the Royal Botanical Gardens, where it grew strong under glass. From this single tree, legend says, came nearly all the coffee of Latin America. In 1723, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu smuggled a cutting from that royal plant aboard his ship bound for Martinique in the Caribbean. His diary tells a story almost mythic. He shared his water ration with the seedling during storms, shielding it from pirates and salt winds. When he arrived, he planted it carefully in the island's volcanic soil. The plant thrived, multiplied, and within decades, the Caribbean was filled with coffee trees. From Martinique, the plant spread to Saint-Domingue, to Guadeloupe, to Jamaica, and eventually to Brazil. Brazil's vastness was a revelation. Its climate, its rivers, its forests, all seemed designed for the coffee tree. The Portuguese crown saw what the Dutch and French already knew: coffee was wealth that grew on trees. By the early 19th century, Brazil had become the largest coffee producer in the world. But the system was built, once again, on bondage. After the Haitian Revolution destroyed France's Caribbean plantations, planters fled to Brazil and Cuba, bringing their methods with them. Slavery, already entrenched, expanded to feed the new demand. Millions of Africans were shipped across the Atlantic to work the endless fields. The rhythm of the whip replaced the rhythm of prayer. Each cup of coffee that warmed Europe's hands in the 1800s carried with it the breath of those who harvested it under the sun. As plantations grew, so did infrastructure. Roads, ports, and railways were built not for people, but for beans. Towns rose around processing mills. The countryside was reshaped into rows of green and brown, a living machine designed to feed the world's appetite for energy. Coffee had completed its transformation from sacred ritual to commodity. It was no longer a symbol of devotion or conversation, but of control. The plant had become a servant of empires, its roots tangled with greed. In the Dutch East Indies, entire populations were trapped by debt. In Brazil, coffee barons built fortunes and mansions, their wealth measured by acres and slaves. The land itself seemed to serve the drink. Even independence movements, when they came, could not fully break the pattern. The new republics inherited both freedom and dependence, the paradox that coffee had created. Yet, amid this system of exploitation, coffee also connected the world more intimately than ever before. Ships carried beans across oceans, uniting farmers in Java, merchants in Lisbon, and drinkers in Paris in one shared ritual. The drink of monks had become the bloodstream of globalization. Still, the plant refused to rest easy. It carried its own curse, the risk of disease. In the mid-19th century, a fungus called coffee leaf rust Himalaya vastatrix appeared in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, wiping out entire crops. Planters abandoned coffee for tea, shifting the British Empire's tastes forever. The disease spread across Asia and Africa, forcing cultivation westward, toward the Americas. It was as if the plant itself resisted stability, constantly migrating, demanding new soils, new workers, new sacrifices. By the dawn of the 20th century, Brazil alone produced more than half the world's coffee. Its wealth built cities like São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, but also deepened inequality. The rich sipped export profits while the poor labored unseen. Coffee, once a symbol of thought and devotion, had become an empire's heartbeat, a pulse measured in exports and exhaustion. And yet, even within this vast machinery, the old magic still flickered. On the veranda of a plantation house, someone might pause at dawn, watching mist curl over the rows of trees, holding a small cup and remembering that this bitter drink once came from the prayers of monks and the curiosity of a shepherd. History moves in strange circles. Coffee began as a way to stay awake to God and ended as a way to stay awake to profit. But the story was not done. Because where there is wealth, there is also risk, and every empire of beans and sugar, no matter how vast, eventually faces its own collapse. By the mid-19th century, coffee had conquered the world. It poured through docks and counting houses, through drawing rooms and taverns, through cities that never seemed to sleep. The bean that once grew wild in Ethiopia now fueled the daily rhythm of millions. But every empire built on a single crop eventually faces the same reckoning: disease, dependency, and decline. The reckoning came quietly, in the form of a spore. It was 1869 when British planters in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, first noticed a strange orange dust spreading across their coffee leaves. The disease moved fast, devouring plantations that had once covered entire hillsides. The leaves shriveled, the berries withered, and within a few years, what had been one of the world's largest coffee exporters was reduced to ruin. The blight had a name: Himalaya vastatrix, or coffee leaf rust. At first, planters tried to fight it. They burned infected trees, sprayed chemicals, and prayed for relief. Nothing worked. The fungus thrived in the island's humid air. By the 1880s, coffee was finished in Ceylon. Planters turned instead to a new crop, tea, and the world's morning habits changed forever. The British, who once drank coffee in their penny universities, embraced tea as the civilized alternative. The empire adjusted accordingly. Plantations shifted from the tropics of Ceylon and India to the cool slopes of Assam and Darjeeling. The rust that had destroyed one empire's drink created another's. But coffee did not vanish, it migrated again. In the Americas, far from the blight's reach, the plant flourished. Brazil, already vast and ambitious, seized the opportunity. Its plantations expanded deeper inland, consuming forests and indigenous lands. By the turn of the century, Brazil produced more than 70% of the world's coffee. Ships loaded with beans left the port of Santos daily, their holds filled with the new lifeblood of modernity. Coffee shaped Brazil's destiny. The great estates, called fazendas, were enormous, some stretching beyond the horizon. Thousands of workers labored in brutal conditions, many of them newly arrived immigrants from Italy, Portugal, and Japan. Slavery had finally been abolished in 1888, but the system of control remained. Debt, poverty, and coercion kept workers tied to the land just as tightly as chains once had. And yet, coffee's wealth transformed Brazil into a modern nation. The profits built railways, telegraph lines, and entire cities. Trains cut through jungles and mountains, carrying beans to the ports. Every mile of track was both an artery of commerce and a symbol of progress. The phrase café com leite, coffee with milk, became shorthand for Brazil's ruling class, the alliance of coffee planters from São Paulo and dairy barons from Minas Gerais. Together they controlled politics, trade, and power. Brazil was a republic in name, but in practice, it was an oligarchy brewed from caffeine and cream. Elsewhere in Latin America, similar stories unfolded. In Colombia, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Costa Rica, coffee became king. The plant's demands were simple: sunlight, rain, and labor. But its effects were profound. Small farmers were driven off their land to make way for export crops. Governments rose and fell according to the price of beans in London or New York. The coffee republics were born, nations whose entire economies depended on the world's morning ritual. In Guatemala, indigenous people were forced into debt labor to meet export quotas. In El Salvador, the concentration of coffee wealth in a few families created vast inequality that would simmer for generations. In Colombia, coffee exports built infrastructure, but also reinforced the cycle of dependency. Still, the world's demand grew. The Industrial Revolution had created a new class of worker, urban, restless, and exhausted. Coffee was their companion, their comfort, their fuel. The drink that had once sustained monks and scholars now kept factory hands awake through the night. Even the very act of drinking it changed. Instant coffee was invented in the late 19th century, a convenience for soldiers and laborers alike. Caffeine had become a commodity not just of trade, but of time, a way to buy more hours in the day. Back in Europe, the old coffee houses of London and Paris evolved into more formal cafes and clubs. The spirit of conversation remained, but it had lost its revolutionary edge. Coffee was now the drink of industry, not insurrection. And yet, everywhere it went, the same pattern repeated: progress and exploitation intertwined. The train that carried beans to the port also carried soldiers to suppress uprisings. The telegraph that connected markets also connected empires. The leaf rust had taught the world that even the strongest system could rot from within. But instead of learning humility, humanity doubled down, expanding, consuming, planting more. The fungus spread to Africa, to Asia, to the Americas. But by then, the machinery of global trade was too vast to stop. In time, new varieties would emerge, hardier plants, resistant to disease. But the cost of that resilience would be uniformity. Biodiversity gave way to monoculture, the fragile illusion of control. Coffee was no longer a plant of nature. It was a product of empire. And yet, amid all this, one truth endured: the drink still carried a trace of its origins, a whisper of prayer and patience. A farmer in Colombia, a picker in Java, a roaster in São Paulo, all shared something with those first Sufi monks and Chinese scholars. They too were awake, if not in spirit, then in struggle. The railways, the rust, and the republics together marked coffee's transformation into a force that could build nations and break them. It had become more than a drink. It was a system, an identity, a rhythm that shaped how the modern world worked, thought, and even dreamed. But as coffee marched with progress, something else was stirring in the laboratories of Europe. Scientists were beginning to ask what, exactly, made this little bean so powerful. They would soon isolate its secret, the molecule that had moved the world. By the 19th century, coffee was everywhere, steaming in cafes, simmering on stoves, coursing through the veins of workers and thinkers alike. It had become a habit so ordinary, so human, that few ever stopped to wonder why it worked. Why did this dark, bitter liquid make the mind sharper, the eyes brighter, the hours shorter? Science, that new religion of the industrial age, decided to find out. In 1819, a young German chemist named Friedlieb Ferdinand Runge performed a small experiment that would quietly change how humanity understood itself. At the urging of the poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who adored coffee and wanted to know its secret, Runge analyzed a sample of raw beans. He boiled, filtered, and crystallized the essence inside. What he found were tiny white needles, bitter, odorless, and potent. He had discovered caffeine. It was the first time that the invisible energy of coffee, tea, and chocolate had been captured, named, and separated from its source. Runge didn't yet grasp the full power of what he'd found, but the discovery opened the door to a new world, the chemistry of consciousness. Over the next decades, scientists across Europe studied this strange compound. They isolated it from tea leaves, cocoa beans, and cola nuts, realizing that all these plants shared the same molecular gift. They gave it the formula C-acetanol, a simple pattern of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. But its effects were anything but simple. Caffeine worked like a key in the lock of the human brain. It fit perfectly into the receptors meant for adenosine, a natural chemical that tells the body to rest. Normally, as the day passes, adenosine builds up, binding to those receptors and making us sleepy. But when caffeine enters the bloodstream, it blocks that connection. The brain never receives the signal to slow down. The result is a temporary illusion of energy, a borrowed alertness. It doesn't give us more strength or time, it just hides the cost of fatigue. To 19th century scientists, this was astonishing. For centuries, humanity had used caffeine instinctively, monks, merchants, laborers, all chasing wakefulness without knowing why. Now at last the mystery was revealed. The same molecule that once inspired mystics was now the subject of chemistry textbooks. In a way, caffeine was the perfect symbol of its age. It bridged the mystical and the mechanical. It proved that even the most spiritual experiences, clarity, focus, alertness, could be measured, bottled, and sold. Pharmacologists began experimenting. They found that caffeine increased heart rate, stimulated breathing, and sharpened mental performance. Doctors prescribed it for headaches, melancholy, and even asthma. Tonic manufacturers mixed it with sugar and herbs, selling energy elixirs in apothecaries and traveling carts. Soon, caffeine escaped the cup altogether. It was added to pills, syrups, and patent medicines. By the late 1800s, it was even carbonated, merged with cola nuts, sugar, and flavoring to create a new kind of drink, cola. What had begun as a prayer for wakefulness in Yemen was becoming the foundation of a global soft drink empire. Caffeine's transformation mirrored that of the century itself. Everything, labor, energy, even thought, was being industrialized. In the factories of Manchester and Berlin, workers drank coffee before dawn to keep up with the relentless pace of machines. In offices and laboratories, scientists sipped from porcelain cups as they dissected nature's secrets. Caffeine became not just a stimulant, but a symbol of modern progress, precise, efficient, tireless. Even the great minds of the era lived under its influence. Honoré de Balzac, the French novelist, famously consumed dozens of cups a day, claiming that coffee chases away sleep and gives birth to ideas. He described its effects like a lover's embrace, first gentle, then fierce, then consuming. Others followed: Darwin, Beethoven, Kierkegaard, all fueled by the same invisible molecule. Caffeine had become the intellectual's companion, the worker's ally, and the artist's muse. But it was also a trickster. Its brilliance came at a cost. Scientists soon realized that caffeine did not create energy. It borrowed it from the body's reserves. The illusion of wakefulness was temporary, followed by the inevitable crash. The more one drank, the less it worked. Dependence crept in quietly, one cup at a time. Still, humanity accepted the bargain. Fatigue was the enemy of progress, and caffeine was its cure, no matter how temporary. By the turn of the century, researchers began to study the psychology of sleep itself. Experiments in Paris and Vienna explored how caffeine altered perception and attention. The results were consistent. Caffeine improved performance, but only for a while. The modern age had found its perfect metaphor: short bursts of brilliance powered by invisible exhaustion. Even governments took note. Soldiers were issued coffee rations, Railway workers drank it to stay alert on long shifts. Factories scheduled breaks not for rest, but for refueling. The coffee break born in the mills of America became a ritual of the industrial world. Caffeine was no longer a sacred gift or a luxury. It was a necessity, a fuel for the human machine. And yet, despite all the science, something of its mystery remained. People still gathered around cups to talk, to think, to dream. The chemistry could explain the mechanism, but not the meaning. There was still something profoundly human in the act of drinking together, the warmth, the pause, the connection. In every crystal of caffeine lay a contradiction, a molecule that could both connect and isolate, invigorate and exhaust. It was the engine of modern life, and its symptom. The discovery of caffeine marked a turning point. The world now understood not just that it could stay awake, but how. It had taken the most intimate of human experiences, the drift between wakefulness and sleep, and turned it into data, into commerce, into control. The monks had prayed to stay awake for God. The workers now stayed awake for the clock. And so, chemistry joined empire in shaping our lives, teaching humanity a new rhythm, not the natural pulse of day and night, but the constant hum of productivity. The 20th century began with a hum, the low, steady vibration of machines, trains, and electric lights. Humanity had finally achieved what it had long dreamed of, the power to stretch time, to make the night as bright and busy as the day. And in the hands of this sleepless civilization, one small cup became its most loyal companion. Coffee was no longer a curiosity of monks or merchants. It was a necessity of modern life. Everywhere the world was speeding up. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Telegraphs blinked, trains roared, typewriters clattered. Cities grew taller and louder. Workers poured into assembly lines at dawn and left under electric lamps. To survive in this new tempo, the body needed help. And so, caffeine became the unofficial fuel of the industrial age. In offices, factories, and rail yards, coffee was as essential as the machines themselves. In the United States, companies began offering scheduled coffee breaks to their employees, a small pause in the relentless workday to sip, talk, and gather energy. The ritual spread quickly. By the 1950s, coffee breaks were written into union contracts, a human right for the mechanized worker. In cafeterias, the smell of brewed coffee mixed with metal and paper, a scent that meant both comfort and exhaustion. It was the drink of survival, the gentle rebellion against fatigue. Advertising turned it into an icon. Posters showed smiling secretaries and factory workers holding steaming mugs beneath slogans like, "A fresh cup for a fresh start." Coffee was presented not as luxury, but as duty. The thing that kept you productive, polite, and on time. The irony was subtle but sharp. What had once been the drink of thinkers and dreamers was now the drink of endurance. Coffee kept the world awake, but rarely awake enough to question the system that demanded it. Still, caffeine had its own kind of democracy. It united classes in a way few things could. The laborer and the executive drank from the same pot, though in different cups. Coffee blurred the lines between fatigue and ambition. It was both comfort and command. In America, the industrial cup took on a national identity. Diners served bottomless refills, warm, endless, unpretentious. Soldiers carried it into wars. Factory workers clutched it during strikes. Coffee became a symbol of resilience, of optimism, of getting on with it. During World War I, the U.S. government declared coffee an essential wartime supply. Soldiers received instant coffee rations, small packets of powdered energy to carry through sleepless nights in trenches and cockpits. The slogan, "Good to the last drop," became a promise of endurance. Instant coffee, perfected by chemists during the war, soon flooded the civilian market. It fit perfectly into the new culture of speed, just add water, stir, and move on. Convenience replaced ceremony. The slow pour of the Ottoman sezav and the Japanese tea bowl gave way to tin cans, electric percolators, and office thermoses. But as efficiency triumphed, something quieter disappeared. The stillness, the pause, the sacred rhythm of preparation, all were lost in the blur of productivity. Coffee had become purely functional, its magic reduced to chemistry. Yet even within this machine age, coffee remained strangely human. It was the drink of companionship, of conversation before the shift, of tired laughter after midnight. The industrial world might have stolen its soul, but it couldn't erase its warmth. Across the Atlantic, Europe brewed its own variations. In Italy, the espresso machine hissed to life. Its inventor, Luigi Bezzera, patented it in 1901 as a way to make coffee, expressly, quickly, for impatient workers. The thick, concentrated shot became the essence of modern speed, strong, small, and efficient. The espresso bar replaced the salon as the new meeting place of urban life. In Vienna, the old cafes survived as islands of reflection amid the noise of modernity. Writers like Stefan Zweig and Freud sipped their coffee slowly, clinging to ritual in a world losing its rhythm. The Viennese cafe became a sanctuary, a reminder that the cup could still hold more than caffeine. Meanwhile, in Brazil, Colombia, and Central America, the plantations kept expanding. Coffee's industrial demand created entire economies built around export. The profits funded governments, but the workers remained poor. The same bean that kept the factory humming in Chicago kept the peasant awake in Guatemala. The cycle of wakefulness continued, rich and poor alike bound by the same invisible stimulant. Caffeine had become the common language of capitalism. Even art could not escape it. The Dadaists and Surrealists gathered in Paris cafes, scribbling manifestos fueled by endless espresso. The smoky tables of Montparnasse became laboratories of rebellion, just as the coffee houses of London had once birthed enlightenment. Each generation rediscovered the cup as a vessel of defiance and connection. But the 20th century's greatest paradox was this: the more coffee the world drank, the less awake it seemed to be. The drink of clarity had become the opiate of fatigue. The same stimulant that powered revolutions now sustained routine. And yet, the ritual endured. Each morning, millions reached for the same comfort, a small act of faith that the day could be faced with warmth in hand and motion in mind. By mid-century, coffee had achieved something no empire ever could: universality. From Tokyo salarymen to New York journalists, from Parisian painters to Soviet factory hands, everyone drank from the same well of wakefulness. And though they might not have known it, they were all participating in the same quiet confession that sleep was a luxury and wakefulness had become an obligation. As neon lights replaced candles and assembly lines replaced hearths, the cup became the only pause left in the endless march of modernity. Still, beneath the hum of machines, a faint whisper persisted, the memory of monasteries, of conversation, of something slower and more human. The bean had traveled far, but its story was not over. Because soon, in the late 20th century, coffee would change again. It would leave the factory floor and return to the cafe, not as a tool of survival, but as a statement of identity, art, and comfort. The drink of labor was about to become the language of lifestyle. By the late 20th century, something unexpected was happening. After centuries of conquest, commerce, and caffeine-fueled industry, coffee began to soften again, to return, in its own way, to its origins. The drink that had powered factories and empires was rediscovering its humanity. It was no longer just a stimulant or a commodity. It was becoming culture. The world had changed. The factory whistles that once ruled time were fading, replaced by the quiet hum of computers and the glow of office lights. The global economy was now digital, mobile, restless. But even in this new landscape of information, people still craved something real, something warm, tangible, and shared. And so, they turned once more to the cup. Coffee houses returned, not as penny universities or industrial canteens, but as sanctuaries of self. In the 1970s, in Seattle and San Francisco, small roasters began to reimagine coffee as craft. They spoke of origin of beans from Kenya, Guatemala, and Sumatra. They talked of flavor notes, chocolate, citrus smoke. They treated the drink not as a fuel, but as an art form. From this movement, a global culture was born, and its name was Starbucks. It began modestly in 1971 as a small shop near Seattle's Pike Place Market. Its founders sold beans, not cups, an homage to the roasters of Italy and the traders of Mocha. But when Howard Schultz joined the company, he saw something larger. Inspired by the espresso bars of Milan, those small, glowing spaces where people stood and talked, he imagined a new kind of American ritual, coffee not as necessity, but as experience. When Starbucks opened its first cafe in 1984, it sold more than beverages. It sold belonging. The stores were warm, familiar, predictable. The aroma of roasted beans became a scent of safety, a signal that no matter where you were in the world, New York or Tokyo, Paris or Jakarta, you could step into the same rhythm of comfort. Coffee had become the passport of globalization. The drink that once symbolized rebellion now signified identity. You didn't just drink coffee, you ordered it: tall, grande, venti, soy, iced, decaf, half, calf, oat milk. Every choice became a declaration of taste, personality, and class. A simple cup had turned into a cultural code. But beneath the foam and branding, a deeper shift was occurring. The cafe had once again become a public space, a place for conversation, creativity, and pause. Students studied, artists sketched, couples met, and solitary souls found quiet among strangers. In a world ruled by speed, the cafe offered slowness disguised as sophistication. In this way, coffee reconnected to its ancient past. The Sufi monasteries, the Ottoman coffee houses, the Parisian salons, all lived again in the glow of laptop screens and the hiss of espresso machines. The circle had closed, yet there was irony in this return. The comfort of the modern cafe was built, once again, on unseen labor. The beans still came from the same equatorial belt: Ethiopia, Colombia, Vietnam, Brazil. The hands that picked them were often poor, working under harsh conditions for wages that barely sustained life. For every artisan roaster in Brooklyn, there was a farmer in Guatemala struggling against drought, disease, and the endless price swings of the global market. The contradictions of coffee had not vanished. They had simply changed shape. And so a new movement arose: fair trade. Activists and farmers demanded justice, better wages, sustainable farming, dignity. Their goal was to give the growers a share of the profit long denied them. Labels began to appear on packages: organic, ethically sourced, direct trade. The small print on the bag became a moral compass for the modern consumer. For the first time since the age of empires, coffee drinkers were invited to look back down the supply chain to see the humanity behind their comfort. Meanwhile, the language of coffee deepened. Baristas became storytellers, describing altitude and roast profiles the way sommeliers spoke of wine. Machines grew more intricate, brewing became ritual again. In the slow pour of a Chemex or the hiss of a French press, there was a kind of meditation. People were learning to be awake more gently. The drink that once symbolized endless motion was teaching people how to pause. Around the same time, technology changed how caffeine entered the bloodstream. Energy drinks, sodas, and pills repackaged it into convenience, even excess. But coffee, in its simplest form, resisted that sterilization. It remained physical, fragrant, communal. Across continents, coffee houses became the unofficial offices of the digital age. Entrepreneurs built startups at cafe tables. Writers drafted novels between sips. Lovers, refugees, and dreamers all found their small corner of belonging amid the steady rhythm of grinding beans. It was as if, in a world of artificial light and digital solitude, humanity had rediscovered the comfort of warmth in the hand. But coffee's new global reach also brought awareness. The same internet that connected drinkers also connected farmers, revealing injustices and inspiring empathy. Documentaries, photographs, and campaigns exposed the fragile economics of coffee, the exploitation, the environmental damage, the threat of climate change. people began to understand that this simple daily pleasure was part of a much larger story, one that stretched back 1,000 years, from Ethiopia's hills to the sleek counters of Manhattan. And still, they drank, because coffee, like history, was never just about caffeine. It was about connection, between people, between times, between the sacred and the ordinary. If tea had taught mindfulness, and chocolate had taught desire, then coffee had taught endurance, the art of staying awake in a world that never sleeps. It had been the drink of monks, merchants, slaves, and scholars, the companion of lovers and revolutionaries, the symbol of empire and rebellion. Now it was simply human again, neither sacred nor industrial, but both. Each cup carried the ghost of every hand that had ever touched it. The shepherd, the monk, the farmer, the trader, the worker, the writer. A silent lineage of wakefulness passed through generations, linking the past to the present with every sip. The chemistry remained the same, C8H10N402, but the meaning kept evolving. Coffee had become the mirror of humanity itself, restless, creative, contradictory, and endlessly awake. We live in the century that coffee built. The hum of servers, the glow of midnight screens, the quiet hiss of espresso machines at 2 a.m. These are the sounds of a species that forgot how to sleep. Caffeine is no longer just a drink. It is the bloodstream of modern life. Every morning, billions of hands reach for the same ritual. The kettle boils. The air fills with aroma. For a moment, everything feels possible. That first sip, warm, sharp, alive, is a small ceremony of hope. The day begins. And yet, behind that comfort lies an unease we rarely name. Because in truth, caffeine is not just something we consume. It's something that consumes us. From Ethiopia's red soil to the skyscrapers of Shanghai, caffeine has become our shared addiction, the invisible thread connecting all of humanity's ambition, anxiety, and exhaustion. It's the molecule of motion, the quiet enabler of our endless race against time. We no longer drink coffee to stay awake. We stay awake to drink coffee. In offices, the cup is both weapon and shield. It signals productivity, readiness, control. It fills the gaps between deadlines, masks the edges of fatigue. The world has learned to measure worth in hours worked, not in moments lived, and caffeine is the chemical that makes that illusion possible. But the body keeps count even when we don't. The sleeplessness, the restlessness, the quiet hum behind the eyes, these are the debts we pay for borrowed energy. The same molecule that once fueled enlightenment now fuels exhaustion. And yet, we can't let it go. Because caffeine is also the closest thing we have to grace in a world that never stops moving. It's the pause between breaths, the warmth between strangers. It gives us permission to stop, even as it pushes us forward. There is something profoundly human in that contradiction. When you sit in a cafe, watching steam rise from a cup, you are part of a lineage that stretches back 1,000 years. You are sharing a moment with the Ethiopian shepherd who watched his goats dance on the hills, with the Sufi monk who prayed through the night, with the Ottoman scholar, the Parisian dreamer, the Brazilian worker, the American clerk, all of them awake, all of them searching for something, purpose, peace, or simply the strength to keep going. In that sense, caffeine is not just chemistry, it's continuity. It connects past and present, faith and fatigue. It's the spark that keeps civilization blinking through the dark. But now, in this century of glowing screens and sleepless cities, we face a question the monks never imagined. What happens when wakefulness becomes permanent? Our world runs on caffeine, but it also runs out of rest. Nights have vanished into blue light. Mornings begin before dawn. We check messages before our eyes adjust. The gift of wakefulness has become a cage of constant alertness. And still, we drink. Because deep down, we hope the cup can hold more than caffeine, that it can hold meaning. Perhaps that's why coffee endures. Not as a product, not even as a habit, but as a form of ritual, a tiny act of remembrance. Every pour, every sip, is a small rebellion against the blur of modern life. You lift the cup, and for a heartbeat, you're not a worker or a citizen or a statistic. You're simply human, awake, alive. And maybe that's what caffeine has always offered us, not just energy, but awareness. Not just endurance, but connection. It reminds us that consciousness itself is fragile, fleeting, miraculous. That to be awake is both a privilege and a burden. The world we built on caffeine hums endlessly. The sleepless servers, the 24-hour lights, the people chasing deadlines under stars that no longer mean night. But somewhere, beneath the noise, the same old rhythm still beats, the quiet pulse that began in a berry, a leaf, a seed. We chase wakefulness, but what we really crave is presence. The monks once drank coffee to stay awake with God. Now we drink it to stay awake with the world, and maybe, in those quiet dawns or late night hours, we find a little of both. So the next time you raise your cup, pause. Feel its warmth in your hands. Listen to the silence beneath the hum. Remember the journey that brought it to you, from wild forests to global empires, from sacred prayers to sleepless cities. Caffeine built the modern world, but it also built a mirror. In its dark surface, we see everything we've become, curious, creative, restless, and still reaching for one more moment of wakefulness before the dark returns. And perhaps that's enough, because even in a world that can't stop moving, there is beauty in the simple act of being awake together. The story of caffeine ends where it began, not with chemistry or empire, but with a single sip under a quiet sky, reminding us that wakefulness, like history itself, is both a gift and a burden. Thank you for staying awake with me through this story. If you've made it this far, perhaps something in this journey, the monks, the merchants, the scent of ancient coffee, has stayed with you tonight. At Silent History Secrets, we share stories like this one, slow, thoughtful tales from the past that help you drift gently into rest while exploring the hidden corners of history. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep uncovering these quiet truths, the ones that whisper between centuries. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your dreams rich, and your cup always warm. Subscribe now to Silent History Secrets, where the past never truly sleeps.